We're now going to head into the panel discussion. I seem to have lost connection completely here, but I will keep on going and maybe we can pick this up. So the panel discussion today is here to discuss the findings and implications of the Orbitas report. We have a great panel here. Unfortunately, Emily Iskell, the head of climate and environment at Storebrand, is unable to join us, but we do have some great people on the line here with us. So first of all, we've got Carsten Sack, who's the Director General of the German Federal Ministry for Environmental, Nature Conservation and Nuclear Safety. We've also got Christina Hastings-Newsome, who's the Global Sustainability Lead at Lewis Dreyfus & Co. And we've got Graham Stock, who's a partner at Blue Bay Asset Management. And finally, we've got one of the authors of the report, Shali Venugopal, who's from Concordian Global, who is, like I said, one of the lead authors of the report that's being launched today. We're going to go straight into this. I'm just going to start by asking you, Carsten. Your background, obviously, you've taken lots of different roles, including being the German chief negotiator at the international climate meetings. What can governments do to encourage the financial sector to transition financing away from these damaging commodity productions that we're seeing in this report here today?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for inviting me. Before answering your question, let me first praise the report. We are, as Mark Kenmer mentioned, proud supporters of the Orbitas initiative through GIZ. And I hope that today's launch of the reports and the online tools will encourage investors along agricultural supply chains to screen their finance books and portfolios for transition risks. The shift to a more sustainable path is not only possible, scientific evidence, as just was pointed out, suggests that responsible investments can improve returns too. So what can governments do to support the transition? I think there are various ways, including through regulation and trade rules, disclosure and transparency requirements, as well as sustainability definitions for the financial sector. Governments can also stimulate impact investments and the green finance market, e.g. by supporting blended finance vehicles that help to de-risk private investments into sustainable commodity production. Let me stress 3 points. First, governments can send signals to the financial sector through demand-side measures, which reduce consumers' imported deforestation footprint. An increasing number of encouraging initiatives are underway, which will increase the risk of stranded assets in supply chains. This includes the EU Green Deal and the EU Biodiversity Strategy for 2030. EU environment ministers, and you know we have the EU presidency currently, endorsed the strategy recently, which envisages regulatory and other measures to promote more sustainable economic value chains and deforestation-free imported products. The UK, as we heard, plans to introduce a mandatory supply chain due diligence obligation. We in Germany issued national guidelines on deforestation-free agricultural commodities, and the Amsterdam Declarations Partnership facilitates European work in this regard. In my opinion, it's equally important to engage with major consumers and work towards a coordinated response regarding consumer-driven market signals. The EU-China dialogue, and I was online with them today again, is one opportunity to do so. This should go beyond a call for voluntary commitments, which have not been sufficient to solve the problem. Moreover, trade agreements will have to include strong sustainability provisions and compliance mechanisms in the future. The second point I would like to make is that we need a forward-looking financial system that is geared towards sustainability. To start with my own government, Germany has created a Sustainable Finance Committee last year, which is advising the government regarding its sustainable finance strategy. Through the committee, we are pooling expertise and foster dialogue among all relevant players. One long-term goal of the strategy is to use sustainable finance as a competitive advantage to boost Germany's attractiveness for business and finance. The EU, as you know, is working to integrate sustainability consideration into its financial policy frameworks, e.g. through the EU taxonomy and disclosure requirements in the financial and business sector. My observation is that the forest and land use sector is oftentimes not sufficiently considered in such discussion. So far, it is all about energy and transport, but as others were saying earlier on, I'm pretty clear that the focus will shift to this sector in a few moments. My last and third point is it is much about assistance and international cooperation. And through a big program which we run in my department, we, the German Ministry for the Environment, are supporting many forest countries, and we're also supporting the transition by promoting a high level of transparency in agricultural supply chains through investments like the ones supporting Orbitas. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Carsten. And it's great to hear that there's so much going on in Germany. You mentioned there that you are helping other countries as well from the German government perspective. Can you just say a little bit more about that?
Yes, for example, Peru was mentioned earlier on, but also Indonesia. We're doing through GIZ. It's a big asset that we have the experts on the ground are helping countries building up the regimes within their countries. So explaining to local communities what it means to reap the benefits of more sustainable production of commodities. So we are assisting governments in setting up regulatory frameworks in Indonesia, in Peru, but we are also having schemes which pay for performance. So if a country, which we helped developing standards in Colombia, for example, deliver just no deforestation-free products, they get a premium, and therefore we encourage economical behavior through setting or through introducing a market signal into the system.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And we've just heard there from a government perspective. I'd like to bring in the investor perspective now and maybe come to you, Graham. You're obviously an investor in sovereign bonds. What do you think about the risks and opportunities associated with this climate transition?
We think it's very important. I mean, as sovereign investors, we think about a wide range of credit metrics, the balance of payments, the strength of the banking system, and so on. But the most important in many ways is the fiscal position of sovereign governments, and then how that compounds over years into the debt burden and the sustainability of that debt burden. And a key driver of both fiscal performance and debt sustainability is the growth rate of the economy. And so to the extent that climate transition risks jeopardize or indeed boost growth prospects in individual economies, it's central to our thinking. I think that the Orbitas report sheds some very interesting light on the situation in three key countries, Peru, Colombia, and Indonesia. And these are sort of issues that we'll always think about in countries that have tropical agriculture exposure, just as we have for many years around energy transition risks and countries that rely heavily on oil or coal production. If we worry about climate transition risks, then the first port of call is to engage with the governments concerned, particularly if we don't think they're responding effectively. One high-profile example recently, we're co-chairing a policy dialogue on deforestation with the government of Brazil, encouraging them to properly enforce their forest code, to get to grips with the forest fire problem that they've had in recent years, or for decades, but increasingly in recent years. And not just to toughen up the existing legislation, which we think is good, but to enforce it properly, to provide more transparency around deforestation, around supply chains, so that we and other investors can better understand the situation and again properly price the risk. Ultimately, if they're not responding properly, then credit risks are going to rise. They're going to be paying higher costs for their financing in future years. And we think if we can get that message across, not just to the economic teams in these governments, but to the broader public policy position, that will encourage progress on this. So again, I think the Orbitas report is very important in shining light and providing more data with which investors can then engage with the governments in question.
And this has come up several times already about the energy transition and what we can learn from that. I mean, when you look at the investments and the bonds and other things, it's often wrapped up in energy. Are you starting to see that transition towards agriculture?
Absolutely. I think particularly around deforestation risk. So as I say, in Brazil, we've been active in our dialogue. We've had the start of similar dialogue with the government of Indonesia around deforestation there. And I think it's becoming more important, not just in emerging markets where we focus our investments, but globally. These are risks that don't just affect the inhabitants of the areas in question, but can have systemic financial risks for companies and governments themselves in these countries. So yes, climate change more broadly, rising ocean levels, deforestation, all of these topics, all of these climate change issues are increasingly of concern to investors. And it's certainly in line with some of the pressure that we're getting from governments and regulators and from our end investors, but it's also making us better investors to think about these risks going forward. As I say, we've always thought about transparency in economic data, budget transparency and so on, but the availability of more data around these specific risks, again, makes us better able to assess credit risks going forward.
Wonderful, thank you. We're now going to go over to you, Christina. So we've gone from government to investors, and now getting into a bit more of the detail. Obviously, you're working for one of the leading agricultural merchants and processors. So what is it that the current challenges within the supply chains that you're seeing? How is that coming through? How can this report help there?
Yeah, thank you. So I'm based in Geneva, and I look after primarily sourcing from a sustainability perspective on the grains and oilseeds front. So answering really on palm and soy. So we have several challenges. They're slightly different for both palm and soy. So I'll try to answer on a kind of nuts and bolts perspective on both. For palm, what we see is the aggregated market signal is fairly clear, back to origin. Maybe this is due to the maturity of the NDPE, no deforestation, no peat, no exploitation ask, that has resonated quite loud and strong back to origin. And we see that translated into purchase contracts. So just as a reminder, LDC doesn't own plantations, it doesn't own farms across any commodity chain except for juice, where it does have some farms in Brazil, but across all the others it doesn't. So it really is plain a logistics provider and a risk handler between origin and destination. So on the palm side, we do see the market ask for traceability, for transparency, for NDP compliance being fairly consolidated back to origin. We also see the benefits that EU Red Scheme has had in the past, and the way that trickles down, the premiums do trickle down to the farmer. We would contrast that to what we're seeing in soy at the moment, whilst there's quite a lot of noise around no deforestation, no conversion, and so on, in terms of the practical, is it translated into a purchase order or a purchase contract? It's not at scale as yet. It really, it really isn't. So what that means from the kind of very narrow slice of the value chain that we sit in, what that means is that the market signal back to the origin, back to the farmer, is not articulated in a tangible way enough for the producer on site. The producer's making decisions day in, day out to clear or not to clear, often when he's legally entitled to plant X, plant Y. So the market ask and the incentives around that market ask, in whatever shape or form, have got to trickle right down to the farm level. So that's just one contrast that we see on a very kind of technical level across. Just to go back to EU RED and so on, the EPA schemes that the US had on their biofuels several years ago. I mean, the role that that played, we see is very positive, in that, for example, since 2008, we have certified either EPA, IACC to be SVS, flows from Argentina, which covers 50% of our sourcing, and it's all conversion free, deforestation free since 2008. And that's thanks to, I guess, the very clear regulatory aspects that EPA and EU RED provided. It allowed the market to compete very efficiently around some clear goalposts. That's also, of course, in palm, we see that as well with the role that ICC and so on has played. Of course, just another challenge, just to pick up, if I may, was on the smallholder side, particularly astute in palm, where there are challenges and where we need to get away as an industry of labeling them as kind of risky. I see some of our downstream peers label the smallholders as risky. We urge them not to, and we are fully inclusive of them and run programs on the ground, in fact, around yield improvement and replanting and certification schemes. So, just a few perspectives here from the trade.
Thank you very much. And I think fascinating to hear you also say there that it's about, you've got to have that incentive mechanisms connected back up to what you're doing in your business as well. And I was just wondering, obviously there's connections you mentioned there through to some regulation and some incentive mechanisms through Europe particularly. What about the engagement with investors? How are you actually having these conversations about these challenges with your investor market?
Yeah, good question. So there's twofold. There's two engagement routes that we have. One is through our RCF facilities, where we are actively encouraged to reduce our own Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions through the RCF. I think it's a $1.8 billion loans, which are linked directly to our own environmental footprint. So that's an excellent provides a real incentive our whole base. Secondly, I've done not with investors, but it's the idea to do it in partnership with others, is with a long-term financing scheme in Brazil as a pilot, where we are encouraging farmers on the ground to expand their business over already cleared areas, so over degraded pasture. It's important, we feel, that we're not just saying no to the farmer. We don't want this, we don't want that. We're actually saying, no one wants to be told they can't expand their business. So what we're trying to say is, please do expand. We need you to expand to feed the world, but we want you to do it over degraded land and not over native vegetation, even if you are legally entitled to do so. So what we've put in place is a preferential financing line over a 5 to 7 year period, tied to certain environmental conditions that we worked with an NGO to help devise. Now, it is in a pilot stage. We haven't achieved scale, and I think that we would like to sort of understand, whilst we have rolled it out and we have got uptake, there are very nitty-gritty technical challenges. One is that the Brazilian farmer on the ground has got lots of choice. lots of choice of financing. This year has been a record boom year, both on both on a market price perspective, good reais depreciation, strong demand from China, strong stockpiling, all the rest. He's well capitalized. He doesn't need to come to to our little scheme. So point one. Secondly, he's got plenty of other financing. So that's been another a challenge for not getting scale. Secondly, is an inherent risk aversion across not only the trade but other players too. So once you start lending to farmers, it becomes a different risk adjustment profile, which puts a constraining factor. So in order to achieve scale, there will have to be some mindset skills and some culturals. Of course, also, as soon as it goes to farmer, one wants to put a lot of conditions and regulatorings on. What we've found is we've got to streamline those again to what really matters. Otherwise, one's not going to achieve scale. So there are a couple of tangible examples. I might just add on a third in terms of our interaction with investors and so on, and the wider financing communities. We've made a commitment, picking up on what some of our has been said earlier on the importance of transparency and so on. We've made a commitment to put increasing traceability and transparency into the public domain. So we've got 70% traceable to farm in Brazil, 80% traceable to plantation in Indonesia, 100% traceable to mill for our directs. All of this is in the public domain and increasingly will be in the public domain. We break down our sourcing by biome, by municipality, whether it's direct, whether it's indirect, and down to farm. And that's, again, published and in the public domain. And I think that, as has been echoed in the webinar so far, increasing that it's got to be a way forwards for all of us.
Yeah, and saying that traceability is really, really helpful to not just investors, but all stakeholders to be able to see really where the commodities are coming from. I'm going to bring in Shelley now. Now, there's lots of numbers in this, Shelley. There's lots of big numbers, and big numbers sometimes scare me a little bit when I see these big numbers of trillions and billions. So what are the challenges of actually bringing together some of this data to actually make sense of it? Because when I see those numbers, like I say, I can get a little bit scared. So make me feel comfortable.
Yeah, I got a little bit scared too working on the project, so you're not alone. No, I think this has been a pretty incredible experience in a lot of ways, because I think what this community has been trying to do for the last kind of 10 to 20 years, really, which is think about how do we incorporate these climate concerns into financial valuation, industry valuation, has really sort of come together in this report. And I'd say, to sort of break it down, this kind of analysis, this forward-thinking analysis is at this point, I think, inevitable, necessary, and needs to become a core part of both companies, business strategies, supply chains, but also for the financiers. And the way that we did this was to first start by thinking about what are valid predictions and projections when it comes to transition risks. So what is the policy world of the future? How are companies going to react? What are new technologies? And how will civil society, but importantly, consumers, also adjust their demand in order to align with these new paradigm shifts that we're going to see, and we've in fact already started seeing. So first step, thinking about that policy and kind of societal future. The second is thinking through how to go beyond what we've done in the past with financial projections and pro forma modeling in general, which is look to historical trends to inform the future. And that's not going to work anymore in this case, because we really don't know exactly what we're getting into here. And I think that's really where this sort of analysis can be incredibly impactful and really set those companies who can do some smart thinking about this ahead of their competitors. And that includes thinking about, like I said, new technologies that might come into play, but also how consumer demand trends are going to shift in a way that allow companies to take advantage of new opportunities. And this is a point I really want to emphasize, because I think a lot of what we've been talking about, and to give you some background, my background is in finance, and recently in the past sort of 10 years have brought this finance background to the environmental space. And it's been interesting to see this evolution of climate as a theme to, I think at this point, a core part of the way that we need to think about evaluating risk and also opportunity. And going back to these sort of projections, we need to think about these very systemic changes in economic markets overall. And that's what I think this kind of project and analysis is quite unique in being able to do that, because we looked at agricultural sectors and tried to project what happens to these sectors as a whole in terms of production, productivity, what type of technologies would be used over the next kind of 20 year to 30 year horizons. And from that, add data availability, data points and industry information on the ground, which is just as important. And kind of marrying these two things together, we're able to make some smart predictions about which companies, which assets, and which industries at large are exposed to these risks, and how we quantify to what extent these companies are vulnerable to risks. And I would just close out by saying that I think this project, as we embarked on it in the beginning, we felt this overwhelming sense of, how are we going to make such big factors kind of come together to give us real numbers, those trillions and billions that you were talking about in the report. And I would say that I think the most important thing to take back from this exercise, and for companies and financiers to take back, is that it can be done. We have found a way to, quantify the general magnitude and directions of risk. And obviously each company will be affected differently, but we have a sense now of what these overall trends are, even in a space as complex as agriculture.
Wonderful. And obviously you've been working with some very good people that have worked in this space for a long time, like Vivid Economics and others, have a lot of wealth of work behind them to do it. Where do you see this going next with the report? And maybe I should be saving this question to the very end, but I mean, this builds on a lot of other people's work as well. We've already had Mark mention a couple of those points. What happens next with this piece of work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Mark. And I think what has been an interesting evolution from this report is, of course, that a lot of different organizations, research institutions, think tanks, companies themselves, and also financiers have kind of laid the groundwork these past couple of decades for us to get to clearer answers about how to incorporate transition risks, but also opportunities into credit risk analysis and equity evaluation. And I think that the next frontier at this point is to bring this to scale. And we've gotten to a point where companies are no longer just thinking about this, as I said, from a thematic perspective, but rather trying to incorporate this systematically into all of their business decision making. In some ways, the same way, we've gotten to the point in the US on this side of the pond for the Biden administration to start installing climate considerations across all the federal government agencies. It's time for companies, to do the same. And this is no longer kind of an individual thematic side piece. This is front and center of what is going to happen, not just in the next 10 to 20 years, but the next 5 years, the next 2 years. As we've heard Lord Callahan and others on this call discuss, I mean, these are issues that are affecting the here and now, not just for companies in Europe, but those who are affected by those supply chains across Asia, across Latin America, across Africa, and really the whole world at this point.
Carsten, I could see you nodding vigorously through a lot of that. What is you obviously have some agreement with that. What is your views on what happens next with this report? What's the role of governments? Where does this lead to within Europe?
it's not just with governments. It's not just the report. We have this platform, this Orbitas platform, and what I would like to see is that companies and financiers, let's say, adopt this platform as a toolbox which helps them to understand and manage the risks and really take good examples of forest positive investment decisions and carry them forward. And I think through that we really can create best practice on supply chains which work, and that could also contribute to COP26. And for us as governments, you're absolutely right, is that we need to become clearer of what our demand is through demand side measures on sustainable deforestation, free agricultural supply chains. We can create or at least help creating the market. And I think these unmistakable signals need to get stronger, and that's what we are working on in Europe and also in Germany. But I always ask, what is the alternative? Sometimes the challenge seems that big, and but what we see, and we just heard about it, is systemic change on the climate change front, but also for the business models. And I think on energy, we started that debate some 20, 25 years ago. And now it is just very rapid. In the transport sector, we started, let's say, 10, 15 years ago, and it took longer. And now it's just overwhelming companies. And my hope is that in this sector, we learn the lessons earlier because we have lots more knowledge, and I think we have lots more knowledge also through that report. But the report is important. I think the offer of Orbitas to really help you investors through the platform is key, and creating best practice is key as well.
So the platform there, a real call out that the platform is the piece here. The report kicks it off, but the platform's a place we need to see the action really happening. So Graham, how are you going to be using this platform then? How are you and your colleagues within the sector going to be using it?
Well, it's another tool in the toolbox for assessing these risks and opportunities. And I think I'd strike not an optimistic note, but I think we are reaching the tipping point in this field as well. Supply chain transparency and how it's much more challenging in soy than in palm oil at the moment. But I think even producers in Brazil are getting to the point where they risk being cut off from markets if they don't embrace this transparency. And the agriculture ministry is under pressure to release more data about cattle passports, for example, so that purchasers can track the supply chain in that area as well. And we're at a critical moment in trade talks between the EU and Mercosur, which again is another pressure point. And I think once it's clearly in the vested interest of the producer to respond to these concerns and again avoid the risk of these stranded assets that the report highlights so well, then the producers will respond. Investors are part of that process, as are consumers and governments, and the more light we can shine on the whole process, the better.
And Christina, coming back to you again, the World Economic Forum this year, Klaus Schwab is calling for a reset of capitalism, which obviously fills back in with a lot of this agenda. And even just last year, seeing the steps that were being taken around some of these topics, it is becoming more of a mainstream thing, isn't it? Are you seeing your peers and your competitors also picking this up? I mean, obviously, you're working for a leading organization that is putting this into practice, but is it across the field, or is it just a few leaders still?
I think that it is across the field. There are still big, fairly big pockets of leakage, whether that's to markets or that's, we all know the Southeast Asia, China markets, India are not sending the same market signals as other markets are, and they're fairly large. What is heartening, though, is that when the market ask is coming through downstream players who are typically US or European based, then their global strategies covers their international sourcing, their global sourcing. So that is heartening, and that is a very, very good feature. Otherwise, let's put soy in context. About 8% of beans go to Europe. Approximately, it's a lot more of a greater percentage for meal, but meal is tiny compared to beans. So as just as an example of soy. So all that to say is that I think that when we're thinking of the solutions and the carbon payment for environmental services, soil carbon, regenerative agriculture, all of these are so important. And the tech companies coming up with platforms to enable farmers to sell their soil carbon offsets or to sell they're all part of the solution as well, and are all fantastic. I think, again, from the sort of narrow bit of the supply chain that I sit in, and I love these discussions because you get to see so much of a breadth that one doesn't, look at day to day. But from the very narrow bit that I look at, we see the need to really put the farmer at the center of a sustainable solution, and to really be asking him as well to buy in, such that he is the steward of our sustainable future. And if he can buy into these, the incentives that soil carbon offsets offer, that forest cover offsets offer, that and if he can feel that we don't just that we measure, manage, and value the environmental services that he is providing, and that the land is providing, um, um, I think that we'll be on a very good stride to that, to meeting those goals.
Wonderful. And Shelley, just a final comment from you. We're talking here about getting this to the farmer. How do we actually transmute this? We've got the platform. We've already had Carsten telling us about that. But how do we actually get this down into something very real for those farmers on the ground?
I think what really struck me from our analysis is how pivotal the role of smallholder farmers are with every sector of agriculture, but specifically in these tropical soft commodities that are highly associated with deforestation. I mean, at the end of the day, if governments and companies are not working together on interacting, engaging with these smallholders, we could have very devastating impacts on deforestation, even if we pile all our money into the companies to ensure that they have the cleanest and most wonderful sustainability strategies. And so going to your point about how can we make this engagement with smallholders happen, unfortunately, there's no silver bullet and there are no easy answers here. It's not just a question of access to finance. It's not just a question of technical assistance and training. I think it's a whole host of solutions, and that host of solutions, whether it's replanting discipline, assisting them with land tenure and land rights, which is, I think, really central to agriculture, helping them with financing in those regions where I think they need it, maybe less so in Brazil, but in other regions. All of these are extremely crucial to ensuring that we work with the farmers who are on the ground. I mean, this is their land at the end of the day, right? And I think a lot of us forget this as we're kind of moving down further through the supply chain. But what I truly believe is that we need concerted, coordinated effort, both from governments as well as the private sector. It's not going to work with one group or the other group assisting, because right now we have a lot of market power held in companies, but we have a lot of knowledge, assistance, and resources held with the governments. And so those two things need to come together from north to south and within the South as well, to ensure that smallholders are given that support. And what's interesting is during this project, we worked quite closely with some of the representatives from smallholder unions in the different countries, and they're on board. I mean, this this is not a question of whether they want to be sustainable. They absolutely do want to be sustainable. They just need the resources, know-how, and support. Really, they need that sort of cup underneath them that holds them up to ensure that, hey, if we're going to make this transition, that you're going to support us and be with us through it. And so that's what we need.
And the data in this report, the platforms being developed, is all there to help us to do that. So thank you very much to Carsten, to Graham, to Shelley, and to Christina as well. Thank you very much for that.